Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Lownie.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello, Andrew.
Hello. I'm very excited to have Williiam Dalrymple with us today. A big player as a writer and, of course, also as a podcast host.
I know. Aren't you a bit jealous?
I'm a model. I'd love to be able to repeat some of his successes, but I think he's going to be very interesting. I mean, he's not. It's not necessarily, I think, what people are going to expect to hear unless they've read the Anarchy.
Yes, that's right. We're going to be talking to Williiam Dalrymple, who is a absolutely top historian, and as Andrew says, he's also got a rather successful podcast for is it the Goal Hanger company, Gary Lineker's company, that does the rest is politics, the rest is history. And by the way, guys, if you're listening, we are available, and we're quite cheap, definitely cheaper than William, promise you. But anyway, let's talk about our podcast, which is also quite successful in its own little way. I know you love this bit. Here's some reviews. Actually, this one might make you think twice about our title. Entertaining, insightful, and clearly well-informed, says Merlin from Canada. So much better than the title. Eek. But later change it. The two principles...
It's been an interesting question, the title. In some ways, it makes it stand out, but I think people are a little bit nervous that it's going to be a bit down market, which I hope we aren't.
I think we're perfectly judged mid-market. Anyway, Merlin says that we have charm and we have clarity. I don't know.
Oh, good.
Do you have charm? Do you have clarity?
Well, it's our guests, I think, probably have charm and clarity. All we do is wind them up and set them off.
That is very true. One more, though, because I do love this. Linda B. You'll like this one, Andrew. Linda B. from Australia says, I've listened to all the podcasts and I've now bought 2 of Andrew's books.
Gosh, brilliant.
Yes. And I'm going to buy Andy Verity's book next payday. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Well, that's great. No, it's interesting, the synergy between the books and the podcast. So it is. And of course, increasingly people are going to audio and to podcasts to get their information rather than necessarily reading books. A lot quicker.
It is a lot quicker.
A lot quicker than reading the Anarchy.
Yes, that's right. So Williiam Dalrymple is going to come on in a minute and he's going to talk about the East India Company. Oh, God, really basic primer. This was well, he'll explain it all, really, but it was a company from London that was operating in, well, I think from the 16th century, but became really, really important in the 18th century and ended up basically running India and folding itself and India into the British Empire. And I don't know about you, I did history at university about the same time as you were there, Andrew.
Yes.
Were we taught this stuff? I think we were a bit.
No, I don't think we were. I think it was very much the Ladybird book on Nelson and Wellington and Clive and Hastings. And this new perspective, I think, is really important. That history can be seen from all sorts of different angles.
And William has been drawn into, I'm sure he'll talk about this, he's been drawn into a kind of debate online with various people, critics and supporters, about, should Britain be proud of its past or ashamed of its past, or doesn't it really matter? Should we just try and understand it better?
Yes, I think that's the important thing. I think it's just about knowledge. I mean, I've just read Shashi Tharoor's book, which is quite critical of the British Empire, and I found it very persuasive. And again, I think that's rather exciting. You think you know some history, and then suddenly someone comes along and gives you a completely different perspective. And that's, I think, what we're hoping to do with all our podcasts, really.
Absolutely. I remember I think it's in his introduction, actually, in the Anarchy. He talks about this little castle in this tiny village in Wales. I'd never heard of it. Somewhere in Powys. William says, in this castle, there are more artifacts from the Mughal Empire than the biggest museum in Delhi, because they were stolen, basically, by some of these civil servants / soldiers who took the country over.
To be fair, if they hadn't been stolen, they probably would have been lost. I mean, we might not have them. I mean, this is, of course, the argument with the Elgin marbles. I thought what was interesting in the book is the owner of the castle really didn't want anything to do with him. But no, I think there's a very interesting debate about restitution and where does it start and where does it stop. But one just wonders, would we have the Parthenon now, or would it just have been used to rebuild other buildings?
Well, who knows? Well, shall we ask William what he thinks?
Yes, I think we should go over to the expert.
Here we go. Counting down. Stand by.
Hello, hello, hello. How are you?
I am very well. I'm afraid Andrew has had to leave us. He's having a technical meltdown in his Westminster house. And I'm sure you have higher standards on your own podcast. Gary Lineker would never put up with this. But I'm afraid you're stuck with me, William.
So I'm going to go ahead with it like this.
Well, I'd like to if you would. I'm already recording, if that's okay with you.
Great. Yeah, fine by me. Great.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, taking time away from your own excellent podcast.
You're very kind. Thank you.
And all the other things you do. I think in my introduction, I've already said I'm a massive fan, so I don't think you're going to get a grilling. More of a kind of a love letter. But
I wasn't expecting a grilling.
well, we are the Scandal Mongers. We like to think that we can be quite tough. But no, I mean, one of the things I'd love to do is some of our listeners are from America, Australia, other countries. They probably know very little about what the East India Company was.
Sure. Plenty of scandal there, yeah.
So I thought maybe I could start by asking you just to sketch out, the very basic history of how a company became a colonial power, or however you would put it.
It's one of the strangest stories in history. And I spent 20 years writing this, and I'm now onto something else. And as it recedes behind me, in a sense, just the stranger it is, the more I think about it, after 20 years of research, the weirder the whole story becomes. Because the East India Company was a company, a corporation. It was not the British government. And while it had a royal charter at the very beginning, which it paid for, which gave it the right to trade and the exclusive monopoly in Britain to trade with any point east of the Cape of Good Hope, not just to trade, but also in its founding charter, the right to wage war and to found settlements. And so from the very, very opening charter, what followed, in a sense, was anticipated. It wasn't ever intended merely as a kind of cash and carry or a or a sort of supermarket operation. The founding of settlements and colonies and the need to fight for it was envisaged from the very beginning. But what is astonishing is that when it was founded, the first discussions of 1599, which is the year that Shakespeare was writing Hamlet and Julius Caesar in the same city in London, just 15 minutes walk from the Globe, would take you to the hall, the Founders' Hall, where the East India Company was voted into existence. And at that point, England, because of course Britain didn't exist then, England's contribution to the world economy was the figures are fought over, and of course they're not solid trade figures like we'd have today, but between about 3 and 7% of the world's economy was generated by England in 1599. Now at that date, between 30 and 40% of the world's economy was generated by what is now India. And specifically the Mughal Empire, which doesn't follow quite the lineaments of modern India. It spreads right across Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, and doesn't include at this point southern India. But there's no comparison in the size and power of the two empires.
That's extraordinary. I'm sure most people don't know that, actually. That they would probably think that Britain or England at that stage was a substantial power, but you're comparing an ant with a buffalo. It was
a top second division country in 1599. It was way behind Spain and Portugal, who were enriched by silver and gold coming out of the New World, who already had substantial empires across the whole of what's now Latin America, had already conquered most of the Inca and Aztec empires, and it was certainly much, much poorer than Italy, which was buzzing with capitalist endeavor and sophistication, with much more sophisticated banking networks. And even Holland, which was a new country in 1599, newly freed from Spanish control, was considerably richer per capita and had far more sophisticated financial systems, had a stock exchange, which England didn't have at this point. and very, very sophisticated banking techniques. And so England was not at the bottom by any means, because it had a very successful wool trade, but it was, top second division, Belgium in modern terms, perhaps, which is, of course, is famously what Curzon predicted Britain would become again if it lost its empire. And yet it's not even just, England versus the Mughals. It's one English company in one street in London, and around the time of the Battle of Plassey being the first battle which really the English showed that they could take on Mughal armies. Even at that stage in 1765, which is 150 years after the founding of the company, it's got a tiny little office, 5 windows wide. A century into its existence, it's only got 35 people in that head office. And at the time of the Battle of Plassey, again, 150 years into existence, it only has 250 white guys in India. So how on earth does this company, operating out of something not much bigger probably than your house and maybe the next door house put together, take over the richest country in the world, which at its peak has 1 million men under arms? Formidable army that would defeat anything, and gave good to the Persians in battle, who were the other great power at the time. The Safavid Persia was an enormous, powerful country. So how did it happen? And the answer is bizarrely that it did it by borrowing capital from Indian merchants, particularly Hindu and Jain Marwari merchants, who are the great banking dynasties of India, and using that money to buy Indian mercenaries. So at all points, in East India Company battles were fought with armies that were never really less than 90% Indian.
So the Indians were paying for their own conquest.
The Indians not the Indians, because it was some Indian bankers realized that their best interest lay with the East India Company. Why? Because a traditional Indian leader would regard bankers as annoying irritations, and if they asked for their money back in, or an increased interest, or in any way kind of crossed the ruler, they were likely to be hung upside down by their heels and beaten, which is what happens to a lot of them in 1857 in the Great Indian Uprising. While the East India Company, while full of scoundrels and crooks and guilty of asset stripping and looting everything it could, was a commercial company which understood the importance of paying its loans back on time with interest, and doing so promptly. And therefore, you have this as the Mughal Empire disintegrates, and that's the key point. The moment that the East India Company comes to power is the moment that there's this extraordinary implosion of the Mughal Empire, and this enormous empire which is spread all over northern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. This huge chunk of land shatters almost overnight in 1739 when the Persians break in, defeat the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila, who's a kind of cross-dressing fop who hasn't got the slightest interest in warfare, and he's taken on by a small but professional army, led by this sort of self-made Persian general who has the latest in military technology, the swivel gun that can pierce Mughal armor. At the Battle of Karnal in 1739, he defeats the Mughals, marches into Delhi with the Mughal emperor captive, and 8 weeks later leaves with 80,000 wagons filled with gold and jewels. Everything the Mughals have looted from everywhere else over the previous century and a half is taken in one go. The British did their best to loot India, but they arrived a bit late. The best stuff had gone already to Persia.
I think you say in your book one of the very first Indian words that came into common usage in this country, in England, was loot.
Yes, lutna is a Hindustani and an Urdu word which means to loot. It means to plunder. Lutna, and it enters English in the mid-18th century to describe the kind of things that were being brought back by the likes of Robert Clive in vast quantities. And it's I mean, it's very interesting what words do enter the English language at this period from India, and they either tend to be things that are connected with textiles, such as cummerbunds, pajamas, and so on, or they're to do with plunder, such as loot. And occasionally little bits of architecture. The humble bungalow is in fact bungalow, comes from the same word as Bangladesh. But
your pen portrait of Clive is so interesting to me, because I was part of that generation, I guess, raised still a little bit under the year of victories, the 7 Years' War, which I thought was a war between nations, not necessarily with companies. And Clive was up there with Wolfe and with Nelson, with Wellington as some of the great British military heroes that built the empire, etc., etc. But he comes across as a kind of a sort of psychopathic kind of gangster, really. Perhaps,
I don't think
that's not a surprise.
I don't think you win wars by being, a soft, cuddly toy, a teddy bear.
Nelson was a little bit crazy.
I was fascinated by Clive. Clive is, exactly as you say, he is ruthless, violent, calculating, but there's absolutely no question he's a very remarkable man, and he wins every battle he ever fights, not just on the battlefield, but later in the boardroom when he returns to London, and still later as an MP in Parliament. He has this sort of extraordinary dark charisma where he can size up an opponent, see their weak points, and work some surprising maneuver on them. And in battle, that's what he does. 18th century warfare in India was as much a matter of negotiation as actual fighting. And two armies line up, envoys go between them. Quite often, the battle doesn't take place at all. It's like a chess game, and some solution is found. Clive, who was a kind of thug from Market Drayton, he'd been sent away to the East India Company because he kept, I think it's age 16 and 17, running protection rackets in the village, threatening to break the windows of shopkeepers or divert the town's river into their shops if they didn't pay him off. And so his uncle, who in despair, first tries to get him to the church, and of course that doesn't go well, and then sends him off to the East India Company, age 16, where he falls off the back of the boat. He's such a kind of mess and nearly drowns off Brazil, and arrives without any luggage in India and tries to commit suicide. The whole thing is a kind of catastrophe. But having proved to be a completely hopeless chartered accountant, this is the period when the conflict with the French is just beginning. And he is very, very good at fighting. And what he does is that he just breaks every rule. And rather than a face-to-face conflict in the midday sun, two armies lined up against each other, Clive is brilliant at doing night attacks, attacking in fog at 4:30 in the morning, during the middle of thunderstorms. He has this incredible ability to completely unnerve whoever's fighting for him, even if they have an army 10 times his size. So he's a very remarkable, ingenious man. But is he a national hero? No, because as you say, he's not working for the national interest as such. Although he has also, like the company itself, got a charter from the crown, and he has this strange sort of two-footed or two-faced allegiance, whereby he is primarily the agent of the East India Company, but he also has a kind of special commission in the army, which is unusual. So he's a complicated fish, unlike most of the East India Company soldiers who are straightforwardly working for the company. Clive has sent out on the eve of the 7-Year War for that conflict, also has a British Army rank. But he's exactly the sort of figure for a writer who's a gift, because he's such a fascinating figure. He's in a sense, he's my Lord Voldemort in my book, The Anarchy. Because
you write with a certain amount of righteous anger about what.
But I also write with a certain amount of admiration, I have to say. It's both of that.
Do you think the English, Clive and the company, were any worse than any other faction who were operating in India at the time? Had the French, for example, gained the upper hand? Would it have been better for the Indians, or what? Is it just? It'll be one.
No, I think there's every reason to imagine that any other non-Indian force would have been just as ruthless. And in no way do I try and pretend that, for example, the Marathas, who are from the hills above Bombay, modern Maharashtra, loot, pillage, and destroy Bengal. And to this day, Bengali grandmothers whisper to their children, if you don't go to sleep now, the Bagis will get you, which was the name for the Marathas. Ditto the Afghans, who are coming down during this period, looting, killing people in Afghanistan, were horribly ruthless and murderous. So now I'm not pretending that we're living in a world of angels and Clive is a single dark shade on the edge of it. No, he's very much a man of his times. But the crucial difference is that the Mughals and the Marathas, took their wealth and they built stuff in India. And what they would plunder from one part of India, they would hoard and spend in another part of India. So it would all go round and round. The difference with the East India Company is that for 150, and then particularly the first 150 years, but I'll start again. The difference with the East India Company is that from the period of Clive, from 1760s, for a century, from 1765 to about 37. The difference with the East India Company is that from the Battle of Plassey in 1756 till the outbreak of what we call the Indian Mutiny, the First War of Independence in 1857, which is almost exactly a century later, the East India Company is sending all its winnings back to Britain. So Britain, because this is now Britain, it's not England, the union has taken place, moves in that century from being bottom first division or top second division country to the top of the league, because not only is vast quantities of wealth being shipped, every ship from a prostrate, subjected India, the richest country of the world, just has a mass transfer of its jewels and goods and gold to Britain, which is why across the country this Britain is still dotted with gorgeous country houses from this period. You go some lovely National Trust property with a gorgeous Georgian park and have your scones in the tea room. The chances are that the money has come either from the East India Company, which means some looting and asset stripping and plundering and victories won over post-Mughal armies in India, or it's come from the slave trade, which is operating at the same time out of the West Coast. So ports such as Bristol, Liverpool, and so on, Manchester, are enriching themselves massively and transforming the nature of the country with this astonishing and vile trade, whereby the Royal Africa Company initially, then once it's collapsed, just millions of independent slavers, transport 12 million Black Africans from the coast. Again, I anticipating the whataboutery. Yes, they're buying them from Black African rulers. There's the preceding Arabian and an Arab slave trade. All that's quite true, but the numbers are different. It's industrialized scale.
It was perfect. It took something and it made it on an entirely different scale.
To give you the figures for the slave trade, we're slightly diverting with the East India Company. This is something which whenever you raise it on Twitter or anything else, immediately comes back. What about the blacks? What about the Benin kings? What about the Dahomey kings? What about the Arab slave traders? To give you an idea, there is in the 17th century a massive Barbary Coast slaving operation coming out of ports like Algiers and Salé, and pirates are raiding places like Stepney in East London and Cornwall and Dublin and the Dingle Peninsula and taking people off. But the kind of figures, according to Nabil Matar, who's the Arab reading historian that's actually gone into the archives and looked at the accounts of all this stuff, the numbers are in the tens of thousands. So that, in the course of a century, we might possibly reach 100,000 captives in North Africa. Some earlier researchers have given much larger figures, but they seem to be based entirely on supposition and guesswork. Well, there are documents that document the figures, and Nabil's gone in and got them out, and he's calculated that it's for Britain it's probably about 10, 20,000. For Europe, maybe 100,000. The numbers we're talking with the Middle Passage from West Africa is 12 million.
Extraordinary. Now, there were people, as you know, who thought that it was outrageous and campaigned against slavery, and eventually it was abolished. Now, were there similar people who looked at what was happening in India and said, this is wrong, this is immoral, this is scandalous? Or was it just, we've won, let's take all of the loot we can and enjoy being top dog?
One of the most encouraging things I found was that there was a huge amount of anger in Britain, but only once they knew what was really going on. Because the East India Company had a monopoly, as I said, and you couldn't just, go to the Indian High Commission and get a visa and turn up and wander around Agra and then report back on what the East India Company was doing. No one could go to India from Britain without the East India Company taking them. And there were various attempts to break that monopoly, which resulted in those people being arrested, sometimes themselves enslaved, in fact, and certainly punished and put in prison. And so it's only really when the most awful thing which happens in the age of Clive takes place, which is the Great Bengal Famine. And that is in 1772. Now, to put this in context, there have been famines throughout Indian history. Some Indian historians argue against this, but I, from what I've seen, what I've read, it seems completely clear that all the early English accounts and early traveller accounts of India contain a picture of a very hierarchical society where the poor are often starving and the rich are very rich already. And, for example, Edward Terry, who is Sir Thomas Roe, the first ambassador from the Crown to go to India, he describes, a landscape of famine as he moves in from Gujarat to the court in Agra. But what happens in most situations like that is that, there's an awareness in India that famine is a likelihood if a monsoon fails, and rulers prepare for it, and they build granaries full of, like in the Bible with the 7 good years and the 7 bad years, and Joseph telling Pharaoh to put aside grain. That's what happens. That's it's a basic prerogative of a ruler to look after his people and prepare for the inevitability of a bad harvest 1 year sooner or later. So there are granaries, and there are also a system in place whereby people get employed in these lean years when the monsoon fails and there's no food, and so they will build some spectacular temple or a tomb or a Ashrakana in the case of the rulers of Lucknow, which still stands. The most amazing building in Lucknow is famine work, and the East India Company, which is newly in charge of Bengal, just doesn't understand any of this stuff. All these guys are 20-year-olds. They go out at 16, and they've just conquered the country, and they're trying to get as much money as they can and retire as early as possible to ship it back home and become an MP and buy a nice country house and enjoy a life in Oxfordshire or the Cotswolds or on the Welsh borders in the case of Clive. And so when the famine takes place, there is no grain brought out of granaries, and there is no employment created. And as a result, there are huge arguments among historians about the figures, and the numbers vary between 1 and 5 million casualties, but basically a significant proportion, perhaps a quarter of the population of Bengal, starved to death. And the result and the reaction of the company is not to issue soup kitchens or create work or issue grain, all of which is available upstream. And some of the local rulers in the same area, develop fleets of ships which carry grain from places where there'd been a perfectly good harvest inland or to the west of India. They don't do that. Instead, what they do is they send their sepoys, their mercenary army, out into the villages to gather taxes at the point of a bayonet. And anyone who doesn't pay up, even if their family's starving to death, is hung. So suddenly, as well as the corpses all over the fields and reports of cannibalism and all the rest of it, and people selling their children into slavery and selling off their plows and their cattle and anything else that's still alive, you have gibbets set up at every crossroads with people hanging who haven't been able to pay up. So that at the end of the first year of the famine, when the annual general meeting of the company takes place, because behind all the palaces and the armies and the ships and everything else, there is a share price, just like any other company, and an annual general meeting where the shareholders meet and the directors present their accounts. It's all very weirdly familiar in the mid-18th century. And at the annual general meeting in 1772, the shareholders are told by a pleased-looking board of directors, that despite a famine, taxes have been gathered in full. And the shareholders are so thrilled because they've been hearing reports that things are awry, that they vote themselves an increased dividend from 10 to 12.5%.
Oh God!
And the next year, I mean, this is all, they all go home happy and buy themselves whatever they, a treat with their extended dividend. But of course, this is not sustainable. And what has happened effectively is the company has strangled the goose that was laying the golden egg, and Bengal is laid waste. And the following year, they can't gather any taxes, and rumors begin to spread, and banks begin to collapse. And 13 banks go down like dominoes across Europe, people that have invested too heavily in the company. And this is the point that the British government steps in, because the East India Company is already too big to fail, unlike Lehman Brothers, because it controls about half British imports at this point. And they step in and they buy a 50% share of the company, which is where suddenly the British government gets involved in what up to this point has been a corporate venture. So
did they introduce any kind of a more decent administration? Any
not at all.
No.
I mean, they promote a particularly Indophile and rather attractive character to run it, who's the much maligned Warren Hastings, and he's one of the better figures, much better than Clive. But there's still no sense at this point that this is anything other than a money minting exercise. There's no rhetoric of what you get later with the Victorian period. We're building railways, we're building roads, we're building ports. When the Warren Hastings is brought to court, the prosecution under Burke make this point. They say, you've built nothing, you've just extracted. And this is one of the main arguments against the company. But this was all a long answer to your original question about Clive's reputation. And this is the point for the very first time in 1772, when there are enough whistleblowers within East India Company ranks that for the first time you get them writing in the Spectator, in the Gentleman's Magazine, and so on, anonymous accounts of the Bengal famine, with corpses piled up outside their doors, and hundreds of dead bodies in every street, whole villages wiped out, a handful of emaciated figures in major towns. And this stuff is published, and there for the first time you get an understanding. So the reaction in London is that there's a play put on at in the Haymarket where Clive is satirized as Lord Vulture, presiding over a pile of corpses, and you get exactly the same reaction as you would get to some British cock up abroad, like the kind of invasion of Iraq that you get today. You get a lot of outraged people, a lot of righteous indignation. Horace Walpole writes in his diaries about how dreadful this man Clive is, and he's outdone the conquistadors, Cortes, and so on in his brutality. And that is the first moment, in a sense, that the British public really get a glimpse of what's going on in India. Up to this point, all they've seen is a bunch of people leaving age 16 and coming back with vast fortunes, often as 10 years later. And everyone has suspected that there must be some dirty dealings going on, right? There's a suspicion of the East India Company, the same way that people were suspicious of the merchant bankers in the 1980s, and all those sort of rah-rah stockbrokers driving Porsches into restaurants in Mayfair, and this sort of thing, all kind of Burlington club sort of antics in Oxford. But this is the first time that real material is put out and published in the public eye. And crucially, just to finish this point, because it's really important, it also reaches America, and the fear of the East India Company, and the fear that the East India Company might be let loose on the the American colonies, not the United States yet, on the American colonies, is one of the main reasons that when the Great Revolution breaks out in America, it is East India Company tea that is poured into Boston Harbor at the Boston Tea. People don't connect this. When the East India Company is short of cash, their monopoly, which is exclusively to trade eastwards, is extended so that they're allowed to trade and sell their tea directly in the Americas. And that's where the tea tax, that's where the Boston Tea Party, all that. And it's against the background of these horrifying reports in all the newspapers and magazines, which are reaching the American colonies. They're read avidly by all the patriots, Samuel Adams and everyone, about what the East India Company has done, and the fear that the East India Company is now going to be allowed to do in the Americas what it's done in Bengal.
That's
so. Yes, a very, very long answer to your question.
No, well,
Is there any resistance to this? There is. People are aware of it.
Perhaps possibly one of the reasons there's a revolution in America. 1 minute left. Just a very quick answer. You spend a lot of time in India, and you seem to be made very welcome there. But you must sometimes feel a little bit embarrassed just talking about what people who look and sounded like us did to that great place.
Well, I'm a Scot, and I actually grew up as Andrew did in Scotland, and in my primary school I studied the First War of Independence. So that was Robert the Bruce, and I was told in my cradle stories about what the Redcoats did after Culloden and the raping of the Highlands and the Highland clans. So I think I've been lucky in that I've been quite a good position to write this, in that I'm British, I'm from Britain, my father was a colonial soldier, and I'm from the establishment, and yet I also have grown up always with an awareness that the Redcoats could be murderous, murdering, raping, looting bastards who would destroy a society, and so it's not difficult for me to hold those two things together and to try and make sense of them. And I think that exactly that, the fact that I am from this country, but aware that unbelievable horrors are possible, has given me a good head start in producing a narrative that could be digested both by Indians and by the Brits, and which doesn't appear to Brits as being massively woke and coruscatingly right on, but presents facts, unpleasant facts about the darker side of our past, while also being palatable to an Indian audience who can also see that that there's a difference between Warren Hastings and Clive, and that while Clive is this very sort of dark racist figure, Warren Hastings speaks perfect Bengali, Persian, Hindustani, builds granaries, and that there are nuances. So I think if you present your material, do your research and present your material honestly, and you're not either a hand-wringing liberal or a kind of massive nationalist, and just try and establish a narrative with characters who are living and breathing from their letters and quote them, people can see that you're being fair-minded.
Well, the clock is ticking. Your book is amazing. I couldn't recommend it more. The Anarchy, and indeed your podcast. And I'm sorry on behalf of Andrew that he couldn't listen to this.
The podcast we should spell out if you are, as presumably you are, if you're listening to this, a podcast fan. I do a podcast with Anita Allen called Empire Pod, which you will find in all.
It's very good. And thanks for your time. We have to go.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Andrew, where were you?
I'm so sorry I couldn't join you for that. We've got building work here, and I had to move and use a laptop, which didn't seem to be working. So you had a solo, and it was extremely good and very interesting.
He's a very wise and interesting person, isn't he? And I love his voice too. He's got a great broadcasting voice.
Yes, very, very fluent. I mean, I thought what was so fascinating was the fact how small the company was. And yet here it was with this huge empire, 10 times this in terms of its turnover, and just how it was able to manipulate that and take over.
And I absolutely, I always thought Clive was up there with Nelson and Wolfe and Wellington. I mean, because a lot of these people are also kind of crazy in different ways, but I didn't quite understand just quite how kind of like sort of ruthless and selfish the whole thing was, but maybe that's just me being slightly naive.
Well, it's very much, yes, this was business. We can see parallels now. It's interesting looking at the reviews. He has a lot of reviews on Amazon, pretty much all 5-star, but there are a few detractors who point out the things he's missing or that he has a certain bias. I mean, some people say that he has it in for Clive. But I mean, that's always going to happen on Amazon, particularly when you have quite so many reviews. I think he's 6,000.
Well, I mean, it is an age-old story. Can we really judge historical characters by the standards of today? Well, what other standards do we have? So, of course, we have to try. We also have to try to understand what world they lived in and how they saw the world and what was normal, what had been normal, in the centuries before they came upon the stage. And then building empires and stealing stuff from other people had been what human beings had done since they got out of the caves. And that includes people in India, of course, which he said.
I mean, should we be judging them as historians, or should we just be really reporting
Yes.
I suppose the selection of evidence will give some sense of what we're trying to say. But I think you're absolutely right. We can't. We have to place everything in context, but we have to see it also in the perspective of our own values and maybe universal values.
Yes. Well, it was like that great conversation with Geoffrey Wheatcroft we had the other day about Churchill. I think it's perfectly possible to admire some of the things that the man did that were truly great and truly important, but also, be really shocked at his attitudes, his reactionary opinions of racism. We can't avoid these difficult facts of history, and it'd be crazy to understand the man and the past in full. No, what a great episode, and we've got loads more good stuff coming. Do you want to give us a quick précis of who's up next?
Well, I think you've found someone for next week, and this is a story about an Australian war hero who's been found to have committed some war crimes. And then we have, I think, Martin Rosenheim, possibly talking about freedom of information. Rosenbaum, who's a great expert on freedom of information. And I think we'll be looking at some of the issues there and whether FOI is working or not, and maybe how it should be reformed. And then we may be talking to the political editor of Unheard, possibly about Boris Johnson. That may be something coming up. I can't think what else we've got. Always very varied.
We've just seen a prime minister leaving politics, partly, maybe largely as a result of scandals.
Yes, and a life of scandal.
Well, a life marked by scandals of all kinds.
And doesn't seem to have affected his career until perhaps now. So this may be the end of Boris Johnson.
And our little cause for getting more, openness and fighting against the over-curation of history. A lot of people are talking about it now, not necessarily because of us. It seems to be of the moment, I think. And the thing we did with Andy Verity last episode, a lot of people have been speaking out, even in the House of Lords. Somebody said it's time for more honest inquiry into what really happened. And this isn't something from the distant past, something from 15 years ago.
Yeah, and actually the newspapers calling, and indeed MPs calling for re-examination of the case. So that's rather exciting. Not entirely due to the podcast, but it's good to be carried along with that and to see some change happening.
Well, I think we are, if on the right side of history, I think it's a long past time for a much more open, and I know Martin Rosenbaum, when he comes on, we'll talk about this, a much more open approach to justice and inquiry. Right, well, we can feel quite pleased with ourselves.
Yes, we can. And let's just see what other comments come for next week.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Andrew, and try to tell the builders to go away next program.
I think I'll replace my laptop.
Okay.
Maybe people will prefer it, just you on your own.
Well, perhaps I don't think so. Let's crowdfund Andrew a laptop.
Okay, until next
Linda
week.
B, please buy more of Andrew's books.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.